In this video, we're going to create a new JPQL query, and this time we will need to use our user entity class instead of database table name and database column names to select our record. So let's assume we need to create an SQL query to select one record from our database that matches user ID. Because this is going to be a single record, it will return user entity, and I will call this method find user entity by let's say user ID. And this method will need to accept one method parameter, which is going to be string user ID, public user ID. And I will need to annotate it with add param annotation because I'm going to use named parameters, user ID, like this. So now let's create the query itself. I will use add query annotation. And when creating JPQL queries, they are a little bit simpler. We don't need to provide value here, and we don't need to provide native equals true. So I can start writing a SQL query right away. So I'm going to select a user from, and now very important part, instead of database table name, here I need to use my user entity class name. So I'm selecting user record from user entity, and let me give it an alias user, where user, and again, very important part here, instead of database column name, I need to use entity class field name. So I'm going to match user ID, so I need to select user ID from the user entity class, where user ID equals, and now I will use my named parameter, which I have also called user ID. So this is the name of the named parameter. I need to use it here. So you see the difference? In native SQL queries, we were using database column name here, where user underscore ID equals named parameter. And in case of JPQL, Java Persistent Query Language, we use entity class name and then entity class field names in our SQL query. Okay, so now let's test this method, test this query and see if it works. So I'll go to my source test package, and then I'll bring up user repository test, and at the bottom of all the tests here, before I create records, I'll create a new test method to test this query. So that's going to be final void test. Let me copy the name of the method from here, find user entity by user ID, like this. And now I can use user repository to call my method find user entity by user ID and give it a value of user ID. So I'll create a new string user ID equals, and then the value of the user ID which we used to create a record in our database. Now, because we use this user ID all over the place, we used it in create record methods, and then we used it in many other test methods, it would be good to take this user ID and declare it somewhere at the top, the class level here, so that we don't have to change it in so many places if this ID changes. Okay, so you can do this. I will leave it for now. And so this method find user entity by user ID will return user entity, and I'll call it user entity. And now we can assert that user entity is not null, and then I will use user entity, and I will also assert that this user entity object contains a user ID which matches the user ID that I used to query this record, equals to the value of user ID here. And I will need to assert true, like this. Now this test method is ready. Let's run this code and see if this test method is passing. So I'll bring up the menu and then use a run as JUnit test. Oops, and all our test methods are failing. Something is not right. So let's look at the exception message. It is caused by unsatisfied dependency, error creating bean web security. Let's look at the caused by again, at a different one. cannot create bean, user service implementation, unsatisfied dependency, user entity, user repository. Here we go. So it goes by creating bean user repository. So something is not right with our user repository. Let's go back to our user repository. So we have a new JPQL query that is using user entity instead of database table name, and this is user entity. The class name is the same, or I know why. So here I will need to make a little change. So this class is entity, and instead of entity name, I will create a new annotation and call table name equals users, like this. So let me import add table annotation from JAWX persistence. I'll save this, and let's go back to our user repository test and run this test method one more time. Run as JUnit test. It will actually run all test methods again because I did not select that particular method only. And here we go. We have all 7 test methods passing. So this is another difference when using JPQL. The way we annotate our user entity class is the class. It must have entity annotation, and then the name of the table will need to come with the add table annotation. Okay, so let's go back to our user repository test, and now we can select this method only and then bring up menu to run this single JUnit test method only. And here we go, it works. So let's continue.